Yeah, it worked this time. Okay, so we were in the middle of the chapter about Robert's brother. Robert Moses' brother Paul. Page 590. Well past halfway at this point. If there was negligence involved in the disappearance of his assets, it was on the part of the bank, which had the responsibility of managing the properties for the trust, not on the part of his brother, who had, in fact, lost part of his inheritance because he had invested it in guaranteed mortgages. Okay, we're going through kind of some of like the details, some of a little bit, maybe too much detail for me, but I'm sure that there's some business-minded people out there who are happy about all this. Not even the most prudent investors had foreseen the general collapse of the title companies, which had turned tens of thousands of guaranteed mortgages into all but worthless paper. Paul would probably have understood this if his brother had sat down and explained the situation to him. But his brother wouldn't even talk to him. Once, the few $1,000s a year that the trust fund was supposed to have provided would have seemed like an insignificant sum to Paul Moses. Now it looked as large as a meal to fill his stomach. It might be the only means, of saving his swimming pool. In an attempt to realize something from the dilapidated Bowery loft that now represented almost his entire inheritance, he thought of two ideas. The bank, he learned, was paying a rental agent about $1,000 a year to collect the rents. Why, he wondered, could the bank not hire him to do the collecting instead and pay him the $1,000? Or he wondered, why couldn't the building be sold? He asked its largest tenant if he would be interested in buying. The man said yes and made an offer on the spot, $40,000. Paul was sure he would go higher, and even $40,000 placed in a bank would return him more than the few hundred dollars in the building that the building was netting him annually now. Paul telephoned his brother to present these ideas to him and heard with astonishment a secretary say that his brother wouldn't talk to him. When he telephoned his brother's home, Mary gave him the same message. When he contacted his sister, Edna said she would do whatever Robert wanted. So did Oppenheim, I forgot who Oppenheim is, who, Paul said, seemed to feel I was some sort of criminal or something. So did the bank. Much as he needed the money involved, it wasn't his loss that hurt Paul the most. It was the attitude of his brother. At about this same time, by coincidence, he asked Edna for some pictures or mementos of their parents. She said she did not have anything to spare, not so much as a single photograph. I never blamed Edna, Paul said. Whenever something comes up, she asks Mr. Robert what he wants done and then accedes to it. Now he tried to telephone his brother to ask for a photograph. You'd think they'd let me have a picture, wouldn't you? You'd think they'd let me have something, the oldest one in the family and all. And he still would not come to the phone. He had always been fond of his brother's two daughters, Jane and Barbara. Now he realized he was not going to see them at all. And he couldn't imagine why his brother and sister and cousin were treating him this way. For a while, he thought it must be because of his marital difficulties. What right have they to sit in moral judgment on me, an older brother? He said. But that explanation could not account for their attitude. He simply could not imagine what was behind it. If you're just coming in, we're talking about Robert Moses' brother, Paul, who is like, while Robert Moses is building all the big stuff, Paul is living in poverty. He had a really bad investment in a swimming pool in Philadelphia, and it didn't do well because of many reasons, including the Great Depression. And there was a polio scare randomly in Philadelphia, which is not what you want when you own a pool and you really need it to make money. So he's broke. He's like hungry. His second wife divorced. Well, I don't really know if they divorced, but things aren't going well. And then Robert refuses to talk to him or help him. In January 1941, Paul received a letter that fanned smoldering hatred into flame, convincing him that the motive behind all his brother's actions had been the desire to wring for himself out of their mother's estate every last dollar he possibly could, even if those dollars had to come out of the pitifully few that Paul was receiving. For the letter, a copy of one from the trustees to the surrogate's court informed him informed him that Robert Moses was asking that he be paid out of the trust fund for his work as trustee. For almost 4 years, from October 3, 1935 to August 3, 1939, Paul Moses had received nothing from the trust funds his mother had left for him. During the remaining months of 1939, he had received I'm used to bigger sums. He had received $1,144.54. In 1940, he received $444. In 5 years, then, he had received a total of $1,588. The letter informed him that the fund's trustees were asking the surrogate's court to approve the payment to them, out of the fund, of commissions for their work as trustees at standard trustee commission rates. Each trustee was asking for $750. Together, therefore, they were asking for $3,000. At the same time, Oppenheim asked an additional $750 for himself as an attorney for the trustees. The wealthy lawyer's request enraged Paul. If it was granted, he would obtain from the trust fund Paul's mother had intended for Paul's support, $1,500, just as much as Paul had received from the fund for the previous 5 years. And Oppenheim was only a cousin. Robert and Edna were his brother and sister. They lived comfortably. He often literally did not have enough to eat, but they were attempting to obtain from his trust fund as much money as he had obtained during the previous 5 years. Together, in fact, the trustees were asking for almost $4,000, more than twice as much as Paul had received during those years. Drama. And that was not all the information his brother's letter contained. The trustees now felt, it stated, that the money Paul had been given in 1933 and in 1934, some $3,400, had been given to him by mistake. It should have been applied instead to the bills for repairs and back taxes, and it must now be returned to the trust to build up principal. Since he did not have any money to return, it would be returned for him. The trustees would add $3,000 to the principal by adding it to payments that would have been made to Paul until that amount was arrived at. Paul realized that his brother and the other trustees were proposing that, after a 4-year period in which he had received from the $100,000 his mother left him not 1 cent, he should receive not a cent for another 3 years. Paul could take no more. He could not contest the will. The provision that had been placed in it made it too risky for him to do that. But he could contest what the trustees had done with the money left to him in it. Hiring an attorney, he asked the surrogate's court to order the trustees to pay him the thousands of dollars of income from the trust that they had put back to build up the principal, thereby, in his view, throwing good money after bad by pouring funds for repairs into the Bowery property whose value was deteriorating yearly, while at the same time ensuring that he would get no income from the trust. This is a little complicated, but the gist is that he's getting screwed over, and I believe it. In describing what happened, Paul would tell the author, it was shifted from a judge who would have been fair to me, a judge who ruled favorably in a case practically foursquare with mine, to a judge my brother knew. Court records show that the case was originally scheduled to be heard before James Delahanty, one of the 2 judges in Manhattan Surrogate's Court, who had indeed, in another case similar to Paul's, held the trustees responsible for the dwindling away of a fund's assets caused by a failure to monitor taxes and mortgage payments. On July 17, 1941, however, Paul's attorney received a notice stating, without explanation, the issues in this proceeding will be heard by Honorary James A. Foley. James Foley, James Foley, the other Manhattan surrogate, was a key Tammany figure and one of Al Smith's closest friends. When the switch was a matter of court routine, or whether Paul was correct in seeing his brother's hand in it, cannot be determined. All that is known is what happened at the hearing. While Foley upheld Paul on several minor points, he ruled against him on the key issues, approved payment of the trustees' commissions, and gave Paul a tongue lashing, saying in words that caused the blood to rush to Paul's face when he recalled them years later, "You got the whipped cream, now you want the milk." Parentheses. Now what the hell does that mean? Paul was to say. What sense was there in that? I don't know to this day. Wait, I feel like that feels like a that feels like a line to add to the iconic lines of the book. You got the whipped cream, now you want the milk. What does that mean? That's so funny. To add a further soup con, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but it's the special it's one of the C's that has the diacritic to look Portuguese. Soup con. I don't remember how to say the word. Sorry. To add to add more bitterness to Paul's whipped cream, Oppenheim, as a result of extra work he had to do because of the hearing, increased his fee request from $750 to $1,000 and added on to be deducted from the meager remainder of his cousin's trust, $38.47 in expenses. Robert Moses had been entrusted by his mother with doling out a pittance to his penniless brother. He took part of that pittance for himself. He took away from a brother who was poor while he was well off, who was walking the streets with holes in his shoes and sleeping in a Salvation Army lodging house, who was almost literally starving for want of a few dollars. He took $750. I'm so curious what $750 is in today's money. Like 700 in 1940. What is that worth? It's the equivalent of 16,700, which is kind of a lot. That could be great if you need new shoes and food. Legally, he had a right to that commission, but the morality behind the request for it was the morality of Robert Moses. Foley's decision, all the circumstances surrounding the will, was unjust, Paul felt. Most of his mother's money had come to her from her mother, his grandmother, and her husband, his father. His grandmother and father would certainly have wanted him to have a fair share of their money. Was it not unjust that he was not being allowed to have it? And why she had acted so unfairly? I wasn't present, but I know Mr. Robert must have had something to do with that. Preying on him constantly, moreover, was the feeling that even if his brother had had nothing to do with his mother's injustice, he had compounded that injustice by his later actions. What right have they to sit in moral judgment on me? To refuse him even a photograph of his parents? Right or wrong, the feeling deepened into an obsession. Festering within him constantly now was the conviction that he had been the victim of a monstrous injustice at the hands of his own brother. A single talk with his brother might have lanced that infection, but his brother would not grant him the favor of such a talk. The poison from the infection began to soak into his whole personality. He never spoke about the will to friends. He had too much of the need his brother had to relate to others from a commanding position. He needed to pretend that he was set off from others by the fact that he still had money. Few of his friends and acquaintances knew his true circumstances. Wendell's and Kern and Lazarus would be shocked when they were told after his death of his poverty. I remember quite clearly him telling me that he had some sort of independent income, didn't have to work like the rest of us, you know? He said he had bonds, clipped coupons, so he didn't have to pay taxes. And oh yeah, I remember quite clearly that he said he owned some real estate. But Paul talked incessantly about his brother, criticizing his policies and his treatment of the public. Can't you see the settlement house attitude in everything he does? This attitude of, you're my children and I know what's best for you? In hindsight, many of his criticisms would turn out to be perceptive. You know who it was who made me realize what this overdependence on highways was going to do to New York? Lazarus asked. Paul Moses, that's who. But he put forth the criticisms in a manner so harsh, became so enraged at disagreement, and when this talk turned to his brother, acted so bitter as to seem almost irrational. It was his way of talking about his brother that makes him even more than the usual caution necessary in weighing his charges. It makes even more than the usual caution necessary. Acquaintances who saw him at wide intervals saw a man changing. Lazarus, who had once thought so highly of him, says he had a fixation. He hated Bob. Paul was a good engineer, but to get him off balance, all you had to do was mention Bob. As the symptoms of this fixation deepened, it was no longer necessary for someone to bring up Bob's name. Paul seemed to turn every conversation to his brother. Lazarus said Paul became unstable. Kern calls him quite neurotic, capable of violent hatred. Men sitting at a banquet at which his brother was speaking or being honored might notice him standing in the rear of the hall. He was standing in the rear, although they didn't know it, because he could not afford to buy a ticket for a seat, staring up at his brother on the dais with that look of contempt and hatred on his face, and they would nudge their friends and point out the lone, bitter figure standing back in the shadows. This too contributed to the impression of an unstable personality and ironically made it easier for the crowd around City Hall to believe the rumors. The rumors whose source was never identified that Robert Moses' brother was guilty of some heinous, if unspecified, crime. Very, very odd. Fighting to hold on to the pool. I can't believe he still owns this pool in Philadelphia. Fighting to hold on to the pool, needing every cent he could scrape up, Paul Moses was trying desperately to find a job now, but he couldn't. As day after day, a man in his 50s, turning gray, he made the long, humiliating rounds of the job hunter. He found that although he had for years been a high-salaried, highly respected consulting engineer, now not one of the city's engineering consultant firms would offer him any job at all. Perhaps the explanation lay in his altered personality, or in the rumors that followed him. But there were those engineers who had learned for themselves the hard lesson of what it meant to be an engineer in New York, to incur the displeasure of Robert Moses, who felt that it was not the real explanation. You don't really think it was, do you? Asked Olsen Sinstad, a world-famous engineer who defied Robert Moses once and could not get another job in the city or state for 30 years. Paul did not ask his brother for a job. He would not. But without his knowledge, friends tried to. They tried only once. Karl Proper knew Robert Moses well enough to get an interview without having to say in advance what he wanted to talk about. Karl only went because it was so obvious that Paul wasn't getting enough to eat. We were worried about his health, Mrs. Proper says. But when Robert realized why Proper had come, Mrs. Proper says, he was just fit to be tied. He was adamant and uninterested. It was a brush off. And Paul not only was offered no job by his brother, but he did not find it any easier to find work for a private engineering firm, so many of which were supported by the contracts Robert Moses controlled. In 1942, unable to meet the real estate taxes, Paul lost the pool. These brothers are obsessed with swimming. Anyway, during World War II, Paul obtained a wartime post as superintendent of construction at the U.S. Navy base in Bayonne, New Jersey. Dedicated himself to the work so completely that for months he slept on a cot in his office and became, to a large extent, his old, competent, incisive self again. But when the war ended, so did the Bayonne job, and Paul, upon his return to New York, could not find another one in even the most minor consulting or executive capacity in his field. Asterisk. Why Paul returned to New York, the city in which his brother was in power, instead of trying to make a new life somewhere else, may be explained in part by his age. In 1945, Paul was 58. There may have been another reason also. When the author asked him why, Paul replied, "What, let him drive me away?" It's crazy how he doesn't even know how to drive still, Robert Moses. Paul's brother would, after the war, be placing with the private consulting engineering firms he controlled scores of engineers, often on the basis of personal or political considerations. His control of public engineering contracts was a byword in the profession. His brother was an engineer, but his brother could not find a job. It was damn strange that a guy with his ability, a guy who had held really top jobs, couldn't find anything at all, says one engineer. In 1954, Robert Moses would become chairman of the State Power Authority, the body charged with creating hydroelectric power from the St. Lawrence River. This was the field of Paul's particular expertise. He had, in fact, spent months drawing up a St. Lawrence plan years before. As his brother was well aware, they had frequently discussed it at the time. Robert Moses would experience great difficulty finding engineers with experience in the field, and he could hardly have approached the professional engineering societies involved without getting a recommendation for his brother. Paul Moses expected his brother to contact him about a job this time, but he heard not a word. And year after year, for 10 years, 15 jobs in a city in which his brother was handing out so many engineering jobs, Paul couldn't get one. Paul Moses, this is like another chapter where it's good. Well, this is very interesting, but it's also a little drawn out for my taste. That's okay. Paul Moses did not ask his brother for a job. Paul Moses could not do that. But he did want to ask him again to sell 168 the Bowery, a move that Paul felt would give him more of an income from the trust fund than the $550 he was receiving. His second wife was, as a result of their separation agreement, receiving the same amount. But his brother's secretaries told him that they had been instructed not to put him through. At one point, they tried for a year and a half without getting him to come to the phone even once. And when his brother finally did consent to talk to him, it was to curtly refuse it was to refuse even to consider taking Paul's ideas. Then he cut off communications again. In his 70s, Paul had to eke out a living as a salesman. Finally, this gay, gallant man, whose natural habitat was the opera and Delmonico's, still in existence. Isn't Delmonico's the oldest restaurant in New York? Something like that. He went to ground in an $86 per month apartment that was not an apartment at all, but a single large room, converted from what had been a storage space, with an area in a corner of the room that served as a kitchen, on the top floor of a 5-story walk-up loft building at 105 South Broad Street that could be reached only by climbing long, steep flights of stairs. And there, in the city in which his brother lived in luxury, Paul Moses lived out the last 10 years of his life in a terrible poverty, brightened only by the last of his women, a small, pleasant, gray-haired lady about his own age whose devotion to Paul impressed everyone who knew them. Paul's friends, she appears to have had none of her own, knew her only as Millie. Not one person could be found in New York who knew her last name. She and Paul, although they lived together, could not, because of his wife's refusal to get a divorce, ever get married. But there are indications that she may have been the same woman with whom, decades before, Princeton freshman Paul Moses, in defiance of his mother, had fallen in love during his glittering youth. Oh, that part made me sad. It reminds me of, I don't know, this is a dumb example, but it reminds me of how Prince Charles just only wanted to date Camilla, but then they didn't let him because she was a divorcee or something. And then he married Diana, and that was fraud, and then he just went back to Camilla. Although it's weird, I don't know why I'm comparing them. The building in which Paul Moses lived out his life, located at the last stop on the subway, almost at the very end of South Broad Street, almost the very end of Manhattan Island, as if he had almost but not quite been driven off of it. Okay, I love that framing because it makes it sound like he's in just the boonies, but that is really some of the most expensive real estate, at least now. But there was the 40s and 50s, so perhaps it was different. In the evenings, the area was all but deserted, the streets empty. Millie put curtains on the windows of the top floor loft that was their home and curtained off the little kitchen, but there wasn't much that could be done to make the big bare space pleasant, particularly without money. Of all the things that were missing from it, Paul felt most the absence of books. I had all sorts of reference books, he told the author. Now I have no books. And it wasn't the bareness of the room that was the worst thing about it. It was its location at the top of those steep stairs. The few visitors he invited up there, it was the kind of place you wouldn't want to invite a lot of company, I'll tell you that, one says, all remarked on the stairs. It was technically only 4 flights, but they were so long, it was like 7 or 8, and they were very steep old wooden stairs, says a friend, Louis Schulman. And Paul Moses, who, while remarkably vigorous, had his 70th birthday in 1957. Those stairs were very hard for Paul, particularly at the end of a long day trudging around Manhattan as a salesman. In his late 70s, he would be stricken by a serious illness. Thereafter, climbing the stairs would be very, very hard indeed. Any apartment in an elevator building would have been a blessing to him. His brother was creating tens of thousands of such apartments, low income, middle income. He gave out such apartments as favors to innumerable persons. Any politician with a relative who wanted one had only to ask. Robert Moses would provide, but he wouldn't provide one for his own brother. Paul Moses was to struggle up those stairs until 1967, when, at the age of 80, he died. Paul's room was within walking distance of City Hall and the municipal building, and he seemed irresistibly drawn to those buildings, perhaps because he was drawn to see in public the brother he could not see in private, perhaps because it was the only way he could obtain even an outsider's glimpse of the public life of which, with its concern for great problems, he had always wanted so much to be a part. He not only attended public hearings of the City Planning Commission, but was continually dropping in uninvited to the offices of its staff members. An elderly but erect man, still with traces in his bearing of the old arrogance, still dressed because he carefully preserved the couple of good suits he still possessed and saved for such visits, with an elegance out of another age, still with a crisp, biting way of talking and an air of impatience when, as so often happens, a commission staffer turned out to know less about a problem under discussion than he did. It was quite obvious that he came because he needed desperately, to have someone to talk to about these problems that had fascinated him all his life. Staffers who took the trouble to be courteous to the elderly man found it well worth their while. Schulman, one of the most knowledgeable of all civil servants in the arcane mysteries of municipal finance, he was at the time the director of the Planning Commission's Division of Capital Budget, and a kindly man as well, met Paul one evening at an engineering society meeting and realized immediately that he was in the presence of a remarkable intellect. You don't often get an opportunity to talk to someone like that, so well-versed, so fluent, he says. Thereafter, when Paul dropped into his office, he was lonely, you see. Schulman would find time to talk to him. At lunchtime, they would often walk together in City Hall Park. Schulman found Paul off his rocker whenever he talked about his brother. But about any other subject, Schulman found him a wonderful conversationalist, a very bright, brilliant, refreshing. My wife, what? Oh, sorry, that was still a quote. Okay, I thought that suddenly Robert Caro for the first time did first person, but no, this is Schulman talking still. My wife found him that way too. My wife won't invite anyone to the house for dinner, but she always insisted on inviting him. My wife was fond of him. Another official who was always glad to see him was Charles Hand, the canny old New York World editor and later PR man for Jimmy Walker, who in the early 1950s was an advisor to young Robert Wagner Jr., then the Manhattan Borough president, and later became the mayor. Paul used to hang around City Hall in the corridors, Wagner recalls. If Hand saw him, we'd say, "Come along to lunch." But with every passing year, there were fewer men in City Hall who had known Paul when he had been regarded as a brilliant engineer. Busy young planners considered the old man just another one of the nuts who hung around the hall, particularly if he began to talk about his brother. He'd go into other offices and start to yak away and talk, and people wouldn't put up with it, Schulman says. They would throw him out. Nonetheless, he continued to hang around. He became a familiar, funny, almost pathetic figure around City Hall, an elderly man with an arrogant air and a sharp tongue, wandering the corridors, talking to strangers. Telling this story about his brother, the hero of New York, the public servant who didn't care about money, that nobody believed. I feel like there's always people like that I wonder about, like, you know how sometimes when you go to a place a lot, you realize like there's always this old person that's hanging out there. I remember in college on campus, like there were people that were like sitting on campus and you were like, I don't really know what the story is here, but they're always here. Or apparently there's this woman who like is a little bit, not a little bit, who's like very hated by many people because she like bullies tourists and theaters into letting her into Broadway shows, and then she has really bad etiquette. But she's just this like old woman who's in her 90s, and it's really hard for people to say no to her if they don't know her because she seems innocent. But then it's like, wait, there's a lot going on. Yeah, just the idea of like kooky old people that hang out places. Kind of interesting. Anyway, in 1962, Robert Moses got his brother, then 75, a job. Climbing the stairs to his apartment one day, Paul collapsed. Taken to the Veterans Administration Hospital in the Bronx, he was believed dying, and in some way, word was conveyed to his brother, who came to visit him. It was the first time Robert Moses had seen him in about 20 years. He brought Paul, who had been so anxious to work on the St. Lawrence Power Project, but whom he had given no chance to do so, two gifts. A recording of the opening ceremonies of the Robert Moses Power Dam on the St. Lawrence, and a copy of his memoirs. That is so mean. When he emerged from the hospital, Paul had almost $200 in the world. He had thought he was dying, and he had become terribly frightened that Millie would be left not only alone but penniless. In the most gallant of all his gallant gestures, he did for her what he would never do for himself. He wrote a letter to his brother, who, once he knew Paul was recovering, would not favor him with his presence again, asking him for a job. His brother arranged with the engineering firm of Andrews and Clark to give him one, as little more than an errand boy at $96 a week. Whether or not his brother had given Robert Moses cause to treat him the way he did, no one will ever know for certain. But his sister certainly never gave him cause to treat her the way he did. The plain, quiet, serious, oh, Edna. Robert Moses is so mean to, oh, hello. He's so mean to, I feel like every female character. I really am not trying to, overly read into the gender here. It's just that most of the characters are dudes. He's mean to a lot of the dudes, too. But I feel like especially every woman, he's just like, meh, doesn't matter. Okay, so let's see what he does to Edna. Whether or not his brother had given Robert Moses cause to treat him the way he did, no one will ever know for certain. But his sister certainly never gave him cause to treat her the way he did. This plain, quiet, serious, withdrawn girl grew into a plain, quiet, serious, withdrawn woman, utterly cowed by her mother, with whom she lived until late in her 30s. She married the purser on a British ocean liner on which she was taking a cruise, and by the brother she idolized. Okay, so she was cowed by her brother and her mother. Also, okay, the idea of living with your mom till you're in your 30s and then randomly marrying the guy you meet on a cruise is kind of that's just, I don't know. Life happens really fast, you can just be on a cruise and boom. According to the testimony of all who knew Edna Marion Moses, she would do whatever Robert Moses wanted. Yet when she and her husband, neither of whom had offered the slightest protest when Robert received the lion's share of their mother's estate, moved to Coconut Grove, Florida in about 1940, she found to her surprise that her brother never telephoned her, not even on her birthday, and was noticeably unenthusiastic about talking to her when she phoned. Years passed in which they hardly talked at all. Once, after she had not seen him for years, she asked if they could not get together. Moses' reply was to say that he would shortly be vacationing in Key West and would be setting down very briefly at Miami Airport to change to a smaller plane. If Edna wanted to see him, he said, she could drive out to the airport and see him for a few minutes there. Edna at last got the message. She did not show up. Paul Moses, in his bitterness, felt that he understood the reason for his brother's behavior toward his sister. He had no use for human beings, Paul said. He would just use them up, and then when he had no more use for them, he would throw them away. His brother had needed Edna when their mother's will had first been probated as an ally to ensure that the trustees would maintain a solid front against Paul. But thereafter, he did not need her anymore, and he threw her away. Paul may or may not have been correct, but it is difficult to avoid wondering if there is not another reason, one hinted at in a Wendell's remark. Quote, Robert never discussed Paul with me. He was quite reticent about him. You would have almost thought that Paul didn't exist. It is difficult to avoid wondering whether that was what Robert Moses wanted the world to think. To any mention of his brother, Robert reacted with rage sufficient to ensure that the brother was not mentioned again. In the circle around Robert Moses, Paul Moses was so proscribed a name that in 1956, The Post, in a 6-part series on the park commissioner, could report that many of his associates do not know that he has a brother. The Post series was almost unique in mentioning Paul at all. It is possible to read through hundreds of magazines and newspaper stories without finding another mention. The reason was Moses' attitude. By never mentioning the brother's existence, he led writers to ignore the possibility that there might be one. If, as happens only rarely, a reporter learned of Paul's existence on his own and mentioned it himself, Moses' reaction was striking. As the Post reported, he refused even to say whether he was an older brother or a younger brother. "I'd prefer not to say," he said, firmly. And of course, a man who did not want the world to know he had a brother and was avoiding the topic by not mentioning him would steer away from mentioning that he had a sister, for the mention of her might make it more difficult to avoid mentioning him. He would not even tell the Post if she was older than he or younger, and he would not say where she could be located. In a book about his life, necessarily more detailed than newspaper articles, mention of a brother's existence and perhaps of other details of their relationship would be more difficult to avoid. For a man so eager for publicity, a man, moreover, who geared his entire life toward ensuring himself immortality, Robert Moses' attitude toward books that might help ensure that immortality was surprising. A dozen publishers offered substantial sums for his autobiography. The offers were refused. Dozens of writers made preliminary inquiries about writing his biography. Moses informed each one that he would not cooperate and that none of his records and documents would be made available. That attitude discouraged all but a handful. With those, Moses took a firmer stand, using his influence with publishers to have the idea killed. In 1960, the Harvard-MIT Joint School of Urban Studies asked author and former New Deal brain truster Rexford Tugwell, crazy name, to write one and offered him a substantial sum. By one report, $50,000 for the job. In 1960, I don't even know what that, I don't know. I'm looking it up. $50,000 in 1960. I'm going to guess that it's 10 times, but I'm really bad at, I'm kind of bad. It's worth, okay, yeah, it is about 10 times. $50,000 in 1960 is worth $500,000 today. Crazy. Tugwell says, the former New Deal brain truster hired a research assistant and with him had spent more than 6 months on what Tugwell considered the first step, drawing up a detailed chronology of his subject's life, including his boyhood. At that point, however, Tugwell says, I went to Moses and asked him to look it over. I left it with him, and he called me up in a couple of days, and boy, he blew his top. I went out to his office, and boy, did he give me hell. I said, I don't think I can write this thing without cooperation from you, so I withdraw. Tugwell was never able to understand what had so dramatically changed Moses' attitude. Only one biography of Robert Moses was in existence before this one. Entitled Robert Moses, Builder for Democracy, it was written in 1952 by Cleveland Rogers, a profound admirer, as the title suggests, of the park commissioner, under the closest supervision from Moses and his aides. There is a chapter on Moses' youth, and it does provide a few details, including brief biographical sketches of his father and mother. There are photographs of his father and mother and of the house in New Haven in which he was raised, with the park commissioner posing in front of it. There is no photograph of Robert Moses' brother or sister, and there is no mention of them, not even a reference by name. In this 339-page book on the life of Robert Moses, there is not the faintest hint that he had a brother and a sister. Very weird. This is also a really crazy... Oh, the chapter is almost done. I'm going to probably read like one more paragraph. He had a father and mother too, and the picture he painted of them in the public mind is striking. He subtly denigrated his father at every opportunity. When one of the Post reporters said in 1956 that he had heard Moses' father had been a successful businessman, Moses replied, actually, whatever money there was in the family, my mother had. This attitude, while unfair to the prosperous merchant who had in reality left Bella Moses the bulk of her wealth, was, of course, in keeping with the patronizing attitude Moses had always displayed toward his quiet, gentle father. But the attitude he displayed after her death toward the mother he imitated so thoroughly was not. When he spoke about his mother publicly at all, which was almost never, it was to downgrade her reputation. Here, for example, in a letter he wrote to correct a 1946 PM biographical series, is a published description, perhaps his only published description of his parents. All right, this is a little quote from Robbie M. Thanks particularly for endowing me with $1 million. The next thing to real wealth is, I suppose, the reputation of having it. My father did not give me $1 million. He never had it. My mother left me something, which was not much to begin with, and shrank through neglect while I was plugging at unpaid jobs. My father was, in fact, genuinely distressed because respectable friends deplored my antagonizing our Long Island Park opponents, and my mother, probably rightly, thought that I could take better care of my family if I got out of dangerous and thankless public service and into big, respectable corporation. The woman thus described was quite unrecognizable to a score of friends and relatives who recall her great pride that her favorite son had followed the career in public service into which she had urged him, who recall that whenever another relative inquired whether it wasn't about time he started supporting his family, she defended what he was doing, saying public service was much more important than any private job, and that she had backed up her belief not only by lending him $20,000 to help him create Jones Beach, but by making it possible for him to stay in public service by supporting him and his family as long as she lived. Robert Moses' attitude toward his whole family was striking. The Moses and Cohen clans were numerous. New York City was well stocked with his aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, and nephews. During his youth, it had been a rather close family, and after he came to power, it was still a rather close family, but he wasn't a part of it. With the notable exception of the cousin involved in the matter of his mother's will, Wilfred Oppenheim, no one's naming their kids Wilfred anymore. He generally saw them only on his own terms, in settings he controlled absolutely, at groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings at which he was both host and star. He rejected invitations to their homes. Gradually, he cut off relations with most of them. Almost invariably, they ended in acrimony. One of his cousins, Angie Fink, said she was practically the only member of his extensive family with whom he was still on speaking terms, and that even she spoke with him seldom. It was, Mrs. Fink said, as if he had tried to deny his father, his mother, and his whole youth. Okay, the next chapter is about his wife. I really am excited about this, but I think that I'm going to wait until tomorrow just so that I have something to look forward to. Goodbye.